Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm your host, Kerry Simmons, and welcome to Everyday Eerie, the podcast where the ordinary meets the extraordinary. Dive into the world of ghost stories, haunted objects, eerie places, and unsolved mysteries that will send shivers down your spine. Each week, we explore the tales that blur the line between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. So turn down the lights, settle in, and prepare to be spooked. So today's episode, we are going to be focusing on mysterious events, mysterious places. So we'll jump right in. And so basically, we've all kind of heard about the Bermuda Triangle, which is famous for strange disappearances and occurrences, and the different disappearances that have happened there throughout history. But there's another location similar to this in the state of New Jersey called the Round Valley Reservoir, which brings us to our first mystery, which is the Round Valley Mystery, rightfully called. Now, the Round Valley is located in Clinton Township, New Jersey, and it is just over a 2,000-acre reservoir. It's known for clear blue water, boating, and naturally producing lake trout fishing. Now, the lake is about 180 feet deep, and it was originally formed in the year 1960 when the New Jersey Water Authority flooded this large valley that was once a farming community that surrounded the Cushatunk Mountain. Basically, it's a local person's kind of retreat, a camping retreat, place that people will go scuba diving, swimming, mostly fishing, or it's more famously known for its fishing, I should say. And some of the local fishermen and the local police officers will tell you that there's absolutely nothing supernatural going on here. It's nothing more than a beautiful camper's retreat, but some would refer to it as the Bermuda Triangle of New Jersey. And this is because of the more than 26 disappearances that have occurred here with seemingly no explanation at all. Now, 6 of the individuals who had disappeared here were absolutely never found. And the first disappearance dates all the way back to about 1971. So the first recorded individuals to go missing were Thomas Trimblett, who is a 27-year-old from North Arlington, and Christopher Zajakowski from Jersey City, whose age was not clearly known. Now, the pair were fishing on a 12-foot aluminum boat, which was found capsized on May 4th, 1973. And then in March of 1977, about 4 years later, 2 other men from Trenton, including 18-year-old Craig Steer and 20-year-old Andrew Fasanella, were last seen traveling across the north shoreline. The rescue teams found nothing more than their canoe washed on shore a few days after their disappearance was reported. John Kubu and Albert Lawson went missing in March of 1989, where their boat and personal belongings were found floating along the shore. And even though Lawson's body was found sometime later, Kubu's has never been found to this day. Going on, Jeffrey Moore, who was 27 years old of Ringwood, was the last person to go missing while on a fishing trip with Raymond Barr on October 22nd of 1993. Barr was rescued by a passing ship, but just like so many of the others, Jeffrey's body was never found. Throughout the years, authorities have brought out canine units. They've involved the FBI and the local sheriff's office to search for the missing, even taking a submarine down in 2006 in an effort to try and recover some of the human remains, though, again, none were ever found. Now, there are some legends that state that when the reservoir was first created, couples would drive to the area as a quiet place to be alone, and soon after came in multiple accounts of weird, like strobing lights hovering above the reservoir. Sometimes these lights would last for a bit of time, while other times the light would move into the trees and disappear there quickly. Now, at one point, the famous Jacques Cousteau, a French naval officer and oceanographer, visited the reservoir in his submarine and reported that it was one of the strangest places he had ever encountered. He took note of the quote-unquote town that had disappeared under the water, with houses, buildings, debris, wood, barbed wire fences still under there, as if it were still a functioning town just covered by water. Now, other legends would claim that when one body was found, another disappears, and vice versa. For example, one day in 1990, a fisherman requested that a towboat come and get him out of the water, as his anchor had become stuck on something. Suddenly, up came the body of a missing fisherman, though 3 days later, a man and his friend were canoeing when one of them jumped in for a swim but never resurfaced. So it was like a little bit of a give and take. And how does that happen? How do you just jump in for a swim and you just never come up, and no amount of searching for you in a short period of time, when the friend noticed that he wasn't coming up, you're never found? He just vanished. Now, no doubt the condition of the water, the temperature of it, the general dangers that one can encounter while boating and fishing, they may also be playing a role. But these sudden disappearances and again, the inability to find any human remains is very strange to me. And another thing to think about is that the same site was at one time occupied by the Lenape tribe, whose remains were likely buried in the earth that now lies at the bottom of the reservoir. So you have to wonder, is the disturbance of these remains responsible for taking the souls of fishermen and divers alike, leaving the waters almost cursed? Or is it just a strange coincidence? And next up on the list of mysterious events is the Kentucky meat shower. This is a short one, but an interesting one nonetheless. Picture it. 1876. You're standing outside the homestead just making some soap. That was a Golden Girls reference, by the way. You begin to feel some droplets hitting you and the ground around you, only to look around and you don't find water. You find chunks of meat. Now, this is exactly what was experienced by Mary Crouch in Olympia Springs, Kentucky, this day in 1876 between the hours of 11 and 12. And she described these chunks of meat as being the size of large, like snowflakes, with some measuring at about 2 by 2 inches and some double that size. Now, this shower, so to speak, covered a range of about 100 by 50 yards. And when neighbors and other townspeople heard, they came rushing over to see the meat for themselves. They asked a local hunter to come and inspect it, and he thought, based on what it looked like, that it had come from a bear. Now, a couple of brave individuals in the town decided that the best way to determine what type of meat it was to eat it. Yeah. So they saw the sky meat and said, delicious, let's give this a whirl. Cloudy with a chance of meatballs. Hold the balls. Now, after eating the meat, they came to the conclusion that it tasted like venison or mutton, which is meat from an older sheep and is usually tougher and gamier in flavor than regular lamb, which is meat from a younger sheep. Now, after eating it, after we ate it, after we put it in our bodies, the townsfolk thought that maybe it would then be a good idea to send away a sample for testing. And I mean, what good did it do them to know what kind of meat it was? I'm not understanding that logic. But they decided to send away a sample for testing. And some of the preliminary tests performed by a scientist named Leopold Brandeis identified it as a type of cyanobacteria. He sent the sample off to the New York Scientific Association for confirmation or further testing. And when researcher Dr. Alan McLean Hamilton wrote back with his findings, all were fairly shocked to find that the meat was nearly identical to lung tissue found in either a horse or from a human infant. Now, after several other analyses were performed on other pieces of meat, it further confirmed this theory, as they all came back as lung tissue, muscle, and cartilage from a human. How, though, you ask? Did meat rain from the sky? Vultures. The best guess to what caused this was that vultures had been indulging in a little feast and then vomited. So apparently vultures will often vomit to ward off predators, and will also do so if they ate so much that it makes flying difficult. So, okay, everyone, breathes somewhat a sigh of relief, I guess. However, in my mind, what really needs to be investigated is whose remains were the vultures eating, and why? Why was this body out there? Is there a missing person in the town? Because they need to dig a little bit deeper, but they just figured, yeah, the vultures were just eating a human. That's all right, good. Yeah, cool. It's nothing weird, guys. It was just the vultures eating a human remains that we have no idea who those humans' remains are. So that was the weird thing to me, and kind of a disgusting situation. Very, very strange. And like I said, I mean, that's the best guess as to what happened, but there's really no confirmation that that's exactly what happened, but that was what they theorized. Now, as much as I love to discuss pieces of flesh falling from the sky, I equally love to talk about falling gelatinous blobs, and so that brings us to the Oakville Blob mystery. Now, in August of 1994, in a town called Oakville, Washington, a rainstorm occurred overnight. And when the residents of this town woke up the next morning, they were shocked to see these strange gelatinous blobs on the ground. The blobs were about the size of a grain of rice, and this blob storm supposedly covered about 20 square miles. Now, this story, as it has been told by one of the residents, has been featured on Unsolved Mysteries, so the OG of all things crime and strange, as well as the newer Netflix documentary called Files of the Unexplained. Now, if you haven't watched this already, it is a really cool show, and the story is extremely odd in how it played out. But it was really cool because they interviewed the woman who I'm going to talk about, and hearing it from her perspective was really interesting. So if you haven't checked that show out, definitely do. Now, over the course of the next few weeks, these blobs would fall a total of about 6 times. And on one occasion, Officer David Lacey, he was on patrol and turned on his windshield wipers when he noticed liquid falling, thinking, oh, it's raining, let me turn my windshield wipers on. Only his windshield wipers smeared these blobs all over the glass, which he thought, oh, that's odd for rain. What's smearing? What's happening? So he pulled into a gas station to have a deeper look into this, and he put on a latex glove for protection. And so he touched the blob through his glove, which he reported felt kind of like mushing jello in your hands. Another resident across town named Dottie Hearn had stepped outside noticing the blobs, and she touched one thinking that it may have been hail, but then found that this substance again was squishy and gelatinous in her hands. Now, in just a few hours, Officer Lacey, Dottie, and several other residents would fall violently ill, experiencing symptoms such as nausea, vertigo, blurred vision, and difficulty breathing. It was said that multiple residents in town contracted these flu-like symptoms that lasted for about 2 to 3 months. And unfortunately, multiple cats and dogs were found having passed away for coming in contact with these blobs and becoming critically and deathly ill. Now, it was Dottie's daughter, Sunny, who found her on the floor of her bathroom looking extremely pale and ill, and she is the one who decided to collect a sample of these blobs and send it away for testing. So she initially sent it to the Washington State Department of Health, where a microbiologist named Mike McDowell determined that the blobs contained 2 different types of bacteria, one of which is commonly found in the human digestive tract. Now, because of this, there were some who theorized that these blobs were pieces of human waste that had been dropped out of an overhead airplane. However, the Federal Aviation Administration has obviously regulations that require the waste to be, number 1, dyed blue. Anyone who's taken a flight and gone to the bathroom sees that blue color, and there's a reason for it. And it prohibits the dropping of human waste during flight. Thank God, as it should, for this very reason, because dropping it, I mean, it's got to land somewhere, and it could be, you could be dropping waste all over a whole town. So this was unlikely, even though there were some theories that suggested it. But Sunny was smart and had taken a couple of samples, saving them in her freezer. Nearly a year later, she ended up sending a sample to a private lab called Amtest Laboratories, where another microbiologist named Tim Davis further investigated the substance and concluded that a certain type of nucleus-containing cell was found inside, which is a type of cell that exists in nearly all living creatures, which confirmed the idea that these cells had existed in something that had been alive. So obviously other theories had come about, and another one was that local military bombing practices had basically caused a school of jellyfish to blow up, and I guess the explosion carried their remains to this little town where they were scattered all over. However, Others were a bit more skeptical, considering they didn't all fall at once, but again, 6 times over the course of just a few weeks. So Sunny would then go on to mention that throughout this time, when words spread and investigation into the substance were underway, a group of men wearing all black suits had walked into a local bar to order milkshakes. And these men had never been seen in the town before and had a lot of questions about the blobs that they were asking to the local residents, but trying to be like casual about it and like smooth, even though they're just like walking into this tiny town wearing all black suits, a group of men together ordering milkshakes, which is not weird at all. But after this strange appearance, people started to speculate that the blobs were some part of a biological warfare project. Now, there was never any definitive answer about what these blobs were, and it never happened again, but definitely has gone down in history as one of the most bizarre occurrences to occur in Washington. Again, for a more in-depth kind of rendition of the story, that Netflix documentary has it, and it really is super odd and kind of describes a little bit more in depth about this Men in Black situation and why it's kind of mysterious. Now, since we are on the subject of weird toxic substances, this is a perfect time to segue into our next story called The Toxic Lady. Now, in February of 1994, a woman named Gloria Ramirez was rushed to General Hospital in Riverside, California, after she experienced a very fast heart rate and breathlessness and declining cognition as she began to be unable to answer basic questions and was unable to speak coherently. Now, she was a wife and a mother of 2 and was said to have been a very kind and funny person, and she was just 31 years old and had sadly been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. When she arrived to the ER, hospital staff, including doctors and nurses, obviously rushed to her aid in an effort to save her life, and they removed her shirt to begin defibrillation with a crash cart AED kind of situation. When they went to place the pads appropriately on her skin, they noticed a weird oily sheen to it, and then smelled like a fruity and garlicky smell emanating from her mouth. Now, when a blood sample was collected from her arm, the blood had a really strong smell like ammonia, and the nurses found these like manila colored particles floating around in it. This had the staff super confused, and though they knew that something was going on inside her body, they no longer believed that this was necessarily just the case of a plain old cardiac event. Now, unfortunately, Gloria would succumb to the havoc inside her body, and she ended up passing away just 45 minutes after her arrival to the hospital. Now, the strange part to all of this, aside from what was seen on her skin and in her blood sample, was that one of the attending nurses who had been trying to work on Gloria suddenly felt very lightheaded and she fainted. Another nurse quickly began to experience respiratory distress as well, while another passed out and quickly came back to. Only when she did, she was totally unable to move either of her arms or her legs at all. So she was paralyzed at this point. Now, 6 of the people who had been working on her had experienced similar symptoms to these, which caused the hospital to say, okay, something's got to be done. This is strange. We need to call in a special team. So they called in this special team who, marched on in with their hazmat suits to search the hospital for any like gas leaks or poison leaks, toxins, foreign substances, anything that could explain what had happened. They found absolutely nothing of note, but because they thought that it may have something to do with Gloria, they placed her body in an aluminum casket and sealed it and proceeded to wait about 1 week before they performed an autopsy on her. And they did this wearing hazmat suits too as a precaution, so as not to have anyone experience same symptoms again. Now, 3 different autopsies ended up being performed on her, due in part to people still becoming ill, even taking precautions, still becoming ill around her body. And because they had been unable to come up with a cause or a reason for her passing, they kept repeating it, hoping that something would show up or a new set of eyes would catch something. Now, the second autopsy was performed about 6 weeks after her passing, and the last one was done just before her burial, again as like a last-ditch effort to come up with a cause of death and for the symptoms that her body was causing others to feel. Finally, they ended up with some answers. So the medical staff found that Gloria had large amounts of Tylenol, lidocaine, codeine, and Tygan in her system. Tygan is an anti-nausea medication that breaks down into amines in the body, which relate to ammonia. and could have caused the ammonia-like smell in her blood. So it was also found that Gloria had large amounts of dimethylsulfone in her blood and in her tissues, which is a naturally occurring compound in the human body, and it's responsible for breaking down certain substances, only it typically leaves the body very quickly. Far more quickly than 6 or more weeks later. But Gloria had it present in her body in such a large quantity that it was still showing as 3 times the normal limit, even this far after her passing, which was odd. But it took a while before they allowed her body to be released again, because they were still in fear that it was going to cause harm to others. After all of the autopsies were performed, they still could not really conclude that anything about her body was causing symptoms to those around her. They basically deemed what the hospital staff had experienced as like a mass hysteria due to the psychological effects of one person saying, oh, something smells weird and strange, then manifesting into physical symptoms. And because of the amount of stress that hospital staff members were under, they thought that it was likely all in their minds. Yeah, but the medical staff said, no, absolutely not. These were physical symptoms. These are symptoms that we felt. You know, we do this for a living. It is not uncommon for us to experience times of high stress and anxiety, and we're not passing out left and right, going numb, getting disoriented, having blurred vision. That's just not the norm. So when they urged the coroner to take a more close look at her file for any explanation, that's when Assistant Deputy Director Pat Grant stepped in and decided, okay, we'll look one more time. We'll look one more time before her burial and make sure that, you know, we have crossed our T's, dotted our I's, the whole 9. And he ended up finding his answer. So Gloria Ramirez's skin had been completely covered in DMSO, or dimethylsulfone, in a desperate effort to cure her late-stage cancer. So this substance had been a popular product used by athletes and advertised as a sort of cure-all cream or a body rub back in the 1960s, until it was found to be a toxic substance in 1965 after studies on rats showed some adverse effects. So again, you know, it's one of those times in history where they're like, this is great. This is great stuff, you guys. And then they were like, oh shit, no, never mind, backtrack on that. We saw that a lot back in like the Victorian era. Talked about that in that episode, about how things were like, you know, trial and error. Like, yeah, we're going to drain your blood and see what happens. Think it's going to cure you. And then when it didn't, it went the opposite way. They're like, nope. Yeah, that wasn't the right way. So that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting with this one. Now, because there was a time in history when it was deemed a wonder cream of sorts, and there's always going to be some kind of confirmation bias and survivor's bias, that kind of thing, there was still a following of the substance. Only now, the only place that one would be able to find it was in a hardware store, as the same chemical in this cream can be used as a very powerful degreaser. But the problem is that the one sold in hardware stores is extremely concentrated. So it's about 99% pure versus obviously the amount found in the creams that were used as topical muscle ointments is a lot less concentrated than that. Now, when Pat Grant researched what happened when this chemical substance reacted with oxygen in the air, he found that it was then converted to dimethyl sulfate gas, whose vapors are extremely toxic and can cause not just irritation, but total destruction of cells in the eyes, nose, ears, mouth, and lungs, along with other physical symptoms such as nausea, confusion, and temporary paralysis. Now, the oily sheen to her skin, along with the fruity, garlicky scent of her breath, would further confirm that this was the case, though her family denied knowing that she was using this at all. There was a little bit of a point of contention there between the hospital and her family, because they thought that she passed due to hospital neglect and didn't believe that she had been using this cream, which makes the story all the more sad, because this poor woman was she was so young, and with this diagnosis of late-stage cervical cancer, she was probably just desperately trying to ease her physical pain or trying to do anything that she thought may work to cure her. So it's horrible to think about. But, you know, on the other hand, the hospital staff developed very real symptoms from a very real toxic substance and deserved to have the answers that they needed as well, because God forbid any of these people would go on to experience permanent damage, which luckily, thank God, they did not, but they could have. It's a really sad, strange story, but really sad story overall. Now, Now, moving on from toxic substances, our next story totally switches gears and brings us to another hot paranormal topic, which is reincarnation. Now, this story is about the Pollak Sisters, and it begins in Hexham, England, where Florence and John live with their two daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline, who were 11 and 6 years old, respectively, at the time. Now, the couple had owned a milk delivery business and had 4 other children, all boys, who were all older than the girls. Now, on May 5th, 1957, unfortunate tragedy would strike this family as while Joanna and Jacqueline were walking to church with another friend named Anthony. They were struck and killed by an out-of-control car driven by a woman named Marjorie Wynn. Marjorie was found to be high on phenobarbital, which is an epilepsy medication, and she had overdosed on aspirin as she had recently had her children removed from her care, with some reports stating that this bitch said that she wanted to hit the kids, to make others feel the pain of her losing her own children. Now, I don't know the details of why she lost her kids, but at least they were alive. And if this is true, and she decided to murder 3 innocent children with the possibility that she lost her children due to her own wrongdoings, I would like to spend a minute alone with Marjorie Wynn. But nonetheless, she killed all 3 of these poor children. She ended up being committed to a psychiatric hospital after attempting to take her own life after this situation. But the story's not about Marjorie, even though I'd like to punch Marjorie in the face. But obviously, Florence and John were completely devastated and heartbroken at the passing of their 2 youngest children and their only girls. Now, about a year following the girls' passing, though, Florence would become pregnant again, and John, for some reason, became convinced that she would give birth to their daughters reincarnated as twins. Now, Florence and him argued quite a bit over this theory, as they were both raised and living as Catholics who debated the idea of reincarnation completely. Now, the family had no history of twins, and at one of their first appointments with their midwife, only 1 heartbeat was able to be detected. But still, John could not shake this feeling. Well, on October 4th of 1958, Florence gave birth to twin daughters, who they named Jennifer and Jillian. While this really solidified John's belief in this theory, Florence continued to deny it, thinking this is nothing more than a mere coincidence. Strange, but a coincidence nonetheless. But that was until they began to notice really weird parallels between the lives of the twins with their late sisters. Now, at first, they began to notice really small details that were similar, such as a birthmark on Jennifer's hip that was completely identical to the one that was on Joanna's hip and was said to have like a really distinct thumbprint-like shape. While Jillian had a birthmark on her forehead that really closely resembled a scar that Jacqueline had received from a fall, which Jillian was able to recount, stating, "Oh, I got this from falling on a bucket," which was in fact how Jacqueline had received the scar. Now, one of the strange things about this was that these twins were supposed to be identical, and it's very odd for identical twins to have birthmarks in different areas and with completely different appearances. So they began to notice other physical differences that made them less identical looking as well, with another being the way that they walked. The gait pattern of one of the sisters was very, very similar to Joanna's gait pattern, where the feet kind of poked out to the side a little bit more so. But okay, maybe physical similarities between family members, not all that strange, but it became even weirder when the girls who were moved from Hexham to another town about 30 miles away called Whitley Bay, when they were just babies, were eventually able to identify toys that were given to each sister for Christmas from Santa, calling them by their nicknames that they had given to their respective toys. So it's like, oh, that's my dog Spot. I got him from Santa Claus. And these were toys that they had never seen before. And again, they were able to recognize right off the bat. The girls were also able to recognize areas of Hexham that Jacqueline and Joanna would frequent, including a nearby park and the Hexham Abbey, despite never having been to those places, and again growing up about 30 miles away from this town. Now, John later recounted that, quote, as he was walking the twins up the hill towards St. Mary's Church, one turned to the other and said, "The school is up here where we used to go to, and the playground is round the back." They said this was a detail that they would not have been able to know at all. Other personality traits were said to be eerily similar between Jennifer and Jillian and their sisters, including their favorite songs and their favorite style of clothing, and they were able to identify old neighbors and family friends that they had never met before. But things got really creepy when Florence, who was still skeptical, overheard the girls playing a little game. Every time I say that, I think of Saw, and then I think of my son, who in his full toddler glory will ride his little balance bike through the house like Jigsaw, and he creeps around the corners after having a full-blown meltdown and asked to play. So every time I hear play a little game, that's what I think about. But anyways, during this game, Jennifer was lying on the floor with her head resting on Jillian's lap when Florence overheard her say, "The blood's coming out of your eyes. That's where the car hit you." Now, one key difference did exist, and though it was a difference, it further supported the claim that these girls were the previous sisters reincarnated, and that was a newfound full-blown phobia of cars. So the girls were petrified of cars and would have recurring nightmares of cars swerving off the road and hitting them. Of course, multiple researchers, scientists, psychiatrists had come to study the girls in an effort to understand their relationship to the past. The girls were one of about 14 case studies noted in a book by Children Who Remember Their Past Lives, A Question of Reincarnation, by Dr. Ian Stevenson, who's a scientist. In several of his conclusions, he basically gathered that children were less likely to lie about these things as they were unaware of the implications of this kind of behavior and these kinds of lies. And then other critics would theorize that Florence and John unconsciously were providing bits and pieces of information regarding the girls' sisters and their past, and the girls were simply absorbing that information and processing that information. It still doesn't explain some of the other key similarities, with Dr. Stevenson arguing that because Florence was so distraught in the contemplation of whether or not this could be true, second to her faith, it would be even more realistic for her to disregard the notion altogether, making her like an impartial witness to the matter. So for her to have been feeding this information to the girls would have been almost just as weird, because she was so hell-bent on not believing that this was true, like witness to the matter. Which maybe that was confusing the way that I said it, but basically saying that Florence desperately did not want this to be the case because she was grappling so much with the idea of, God, it really seems like these girls could be reincarnated. But at the same time, her strong Catholic faith and was that the belief in reincarnation is a sin. And she felt that she couldn't give herself over to this theory for fear of being doomed by God. So she was really, really kind of grappling with this idea. And so it wouldn't have been something she would want to do, to bring attention to this and say, oh yes, come study my girls. We're trying to kind of fake this whole idea of them being reincarnated, because she actually wanted the opposite to be true. She wanted it to be nothing more than a mere coincidence. So Dr. Stevenson kind of felt like this was even further confirmation that this was unraveling before her, and that everything here that they had found was authentic. Now, as these girls grew, they began to obviously, adopt their own ways, and the conversations about the past were happening less and less until 1981, when Jillian was about 23 years old, and she began to tell stories of playing in a specific sandbox in her old town, and she accurately described the house and the property around it, even though she had never been to this place before. Now, all in all, it has never been officially concluded that Jennifer and Jillian obviously are the reincarnated daughters of Florence and John, but with all of the similarities between them, and furthermore all the similarities between many individuals who claim to have past lives and these girls, the eerie possibility is always there. There have been multiple shows where they've talked about, like reincarnated kids, and kids will have strange memories of strange places and people and things like that, and it's not even obviously always tied to family. Sometimes there have been stories of kids randomly describing themselves as a soldier from Pearl Harbor or from being in the Titanic, and they have fears of water and fears of loud noises, and they know people, places, things they shouldn't possibly know. And so I it's a hard topic to talk about, because yes, reincarnation, you do wonder where the line is drawn there, but at the same time, there are instances of people having really, really real and vivid memories of things that they can't possibly know. And so you wonder if that's them who have lived a past life before, or if it's a spirit communicating through them, or communicating their life through them in hopes of getting some kind of closure. I don't know. It's an interesting topic, but definitely maybe one that we'll do a more in-depth episode on in the future, because there's so much on it in terms of like what it is and what the religious aspect of it is and what the Bible says about it and what stories there are about people who have supposedly been reincarnated and all that stuff. So that would be a fun episode to do. But anyway, that concludes our episode today on mysterious events. So be sure to check out my Instagram page. Don't forget to send a personal ghost story to everydayeerie26@gmail.com. I would love to hear them. Thank you for joining me today on this journey into the eerie and unexplained. I hope these stories captivated your imagination and that you will join me next time for more tales of the strange and supernatural. Until then, keep an eye out for the eerie in your everyday.